Hello everyone, it's Thursday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Exports are a major driver for the South Korean economy, and so it is important to boost the competitiveness of promising sectors such as semiconductors, rechargeable batteries, and cars. Though the chip industry appears to be bottoming out, it is still waiting for momentum for a definite rebound. And in terms of the secondary battery industry, the country is indeed in a leading position, but high overseas dependence for materials and components remains a concern. How are South Korea's promising sectors doing, and what are other areas that Seoul's economy could perhaps rely on in the future? For this, we have invited Professor Yang Jun-seok from the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, welcome.
Happy to be here.
And we also have TRINH Nguyen, a senior economist at Natixis. Good to have you with us, TRINH.
Thank you for having me.
Now, first question to our TRINH. According to recent data, semiconductor exports grew a month in November for the first time since August 2022. Some say the industry is on a recovery track, though it may be slow. Is that the case?
We already got positive news with the first 20 days of exports, right? Exports came up quite strongly, double digits increase, and the underlying is quite supportive with the chip sector, but not just the chip sector. We got consumer electronics, oil, and so on and so forth. And so Korea, given the fact that the base is very bad for most of 2023, should see a big rebound in 2024 as inventories are increasingly depleted, and if demand recovers, then you should be staged for a rebound. And I think that should be positive for South Korea exports in 2024.
All right, I see. And as our TRINH already told us, Professor Yang, semiconductor market is expected to rebound thanks to many reasons, but one of them is the growing demand for high bandwidth memory with the AI industry enlarging. In what ways could South Korean chip makers use this as an opportunity?
Well, I think we should not expect sort of a tsunami of increasing demand that we saw during the pandemic. I think there will be a growth in demand because of the AI and some of the new development, but it might be slow, but luckily perhaps more long-term in nature because the growth will grow steadily, but perhaps a bit slower than we would like. One of the additional elements that we should look into is, well, we were expecting a really heavy demand for semiconductors during the second half of the year, but it was only realized during November or October. And that's because the U.S. interest rate and the global interest rate remained fairly high, and that cut down the investment demand for semiconductors by big tech firms. Now, if the Fed signal for lower interest rate next year comes true, then we may have very steadily high demand for semiconductors. But if the interest rate remains high, then we should be prepared for a slow growth in semiconductor demand. It will still grow, but it might be slower than what we were expecting.
I see. So there will be recovery, but it could be slow. One more question, Professor Yang. Recently, Dutch semiconductor industry supplier ASML agreed to invest around 1 trillion Korean won with Samsung Electronics to establish a research facility in South Korea, as well as boost cooperation with SK hynix as well. How significant is such a deal for South Korea's major chip makers?
Okay, well, ASML is perhaps the most critical company and link in the high-quality semiconductor supply chain because they're the only company capable of making semiconductor manufacturing equipment that can etch circuits to a narrow degree that supports very high-tech semiconductors. So closer cooperation between Samsung, Hynix, and ASML is, I think, always good news. They can affect each other, they can influence each other's research, and they could more easily develop customized manufacturing equipment that Samsung or Hynix may need. Now, having said that, though, ASML also has a very close relationship with Samsung and Hynix's biggest rival, TSMC. So in some ways, having this closer relationship between ASML and Samsung and Hynix, well, Korea is playing catch up to Taiwan. But as I said, I think more closer cooperation is very good news. Even if we may be behind Taiwan a little bit, this will give us a chance to catch up.
All right, it's good news for South Korea's major chip makers, I see. Now, Trin, based on what our Professor Yang told us, the presidential office noted that South Korea was able to forge a global semiconductor alliance connecting the entire process from design to material components, equipment, and manufacturing, with President Yoon's visit to the US, Japan, the UK, and the Netherlands. Do you believe bolstering ties with such countries would help reduce the geopolitical risks for chips?
Well, I think Korea is positioning itself quite well. I think obviously chips is at the forefront of what the U.S. want to retain because the U.S. is dominating in design and the manufacturing has taken over by Taiwan and of course South Korea. And Korea has been able to basically increase investment in the U.S. as well as getting exemptions, being able to export to China. But China wants to raise its self-sufficiency in chips. And I think fundamentally, with a lot of subsidies thrown at it, it remains quite an important threat to the Korea manufacturing of chips, even if it's able to still have a bit of a technological frontier at the moment. And I think we can see that in other sectors. At the lower end, China has carved out a bit of a space, but it still wants to go higher. And I think you can see that in other sectors, such as EV, solar, and so on and so forth. And so as a result, I think anything that Korea can do to really retain its competitive advantage is quite important moving forward.
All right, I see your point, Trin. Now, since our Trin came up with the EV, I'd like to talk about the secondary battery industry. Professor Yang, shifting gears a bit here. So secondary battery industry is also a very important sector for South Korea. And so the South Korean government is to provide a total of 38 trillion Korean won in policy financing by 2028. Could you tell us more about this plan?
Okay, well, Korean firms, if you exclude China, that's the big caveat. If you exclude China, it accounts for about 49% of global production. Chinese firms are still the largest global manufacturers of batteries. And Korea is dependent on China for a lot of crucial chemicals and rare earths, such as cobalt, lithium, and nickel. Now, the government's 5-year plan is to invest 38 trillion won in the battery industry. Export-Import Bank will double its capital allocated for lending and guaranteeing Korean battery manufacturers from 15 trillion to 30 trillion won. And this, I think, is interesting. Within 3 years, Korea will build a strategic reserve storage facility for semiconductors dealing with rare earth and chemicals at Semiconductor. So if you're keeping up with Korean politics, I think that is a very interesting place to put the strategic storage facility. And then by 2031, the government plans to build up 100 days worth of strategic reserves in these rare earth and chemicals. But perhaps more important, Korea is going to start a recycling project for batteries. It's because, well, rare earths are rare. So we need to recycle the current batteries or batteries which no longer work to recover those rare earths, recover those chemicals so that they could be used for new batteries. U.S. IRA foresees a time when most of its rare earth are coming from recycled old batteries rather than trying to get it from China or other natural sources.
All right, I see your point. And Trin, as our Professor Yang already pointed out, raw materials and components of secondary batteries are reportedly very much reliant on imports from China. Could you tell us how dependent South Korea is?
Korea is actually running a deficit with China and increasingly in areas that it used to dominate, right? So South Korea dominates in high tech and it's an area it enjoys and it's trying to hold on to semiconductor, but in areas and it's already seeing the erosion of intermediates as China, which it doesn't highlight anymore, the Made in 2025 wants to be self-sufficient, right? In many areas. And so its rise in intermediate exports is a huge threat to South Korea. And the fact is that China dominates the processing of raw materials needed to make batteries. That's about 75% of the 4 key components. And it's actually moving into the production of batteries itself, right? As the professor mentioned, China actually globally dominates about 60% of that. And Korea's share of that has declined to about 20% from 30% before the pandemic. Now, if you exclude the China market, South Korea has about roughly 50%, but that roughly 50% is a decline from previously. And China's rise now is to 30%. So even in non-Chinese market, China is seeing a rise. So that is a big threat for China, and then rightly so that South Korea is deploying a lot of capital. Its largest outward FDI is into the US, where it sees itself nodding to having to compete with China, which basically dominate this market through sheer will, through subsidies, through not really caring so much about profits. Profit margins have declined substantially for Chinese battery makers, right? But they care about the supply side of economics rather than demand because they want to continue to grow where areas where they want to be fully self-sufficient. And so as a result, I think Korea will continue to carve out also markets where it doesn't have to compete with China. And I think it's an area where increasingly the IRA is an example where they will continue to carve out non-China markets such as the US, and that it will continue to be an important area of growth for South Korea. And also they will have to think about the supply chain dependency, right? COVID shows us that we're too dependent on China. And within certain categories, that dependency is quite large, and EV is one of them.
Right. And that being said, Professor Yang, what measures should South Korea take to reduce such overseas dependency and perhaps, to deal with China's rise?
Okay, well, we have to remember that we've known that this problem exists for quite a while. As China's technology improves, Korea used to sell a lot of these somewhat lower tech intermediate goods to China, but China has replaced them with their own domestically produced intermediate goods. Now, what Korea should be doing is to improve its technology so that it's always ahead about a certain amount to Chinese technology. I'm not sure if we've done that very well. There has been always a concern that Korea is technology-wise sandwiched between China and Japan. China's catching up, but Korea is not necessarily leading ahead. So there has to be more research, more development into higher technology, higher value-added products, and then for supply chain concerns, one of the reasons why we're so dependent on China is because Chinese products are just so inexpensive that producers naturally gravitate toward the lowest cost producers. So if we do want to get away from that, then either Korean manufacturers will have to find an alternate source which is as inexpensive, which is very doubtful, or the government has to provide subsidies, or consumers have to face the fact that if they want a steady supply, then they may have to pay more because they want to source from diverse sources rather than from a single albeit inexpensive source. And one of the ways around that is probably recycling, as we talked about in the last question. Recycling the elements which are already here. If we develop a good enough recycling technology, we should be able to recover a lot of these rare earth and chemicals that we're currently importing from China.
All right, well, thank you for giving us a direction, Professor Yang. Now, I'd like to forecast the industry, the secondary battery industry in 2024. As we all know, the secondary battery is really important for electric vehicles. And regarding this market trend, worries include the continuing slowdown in the growth rate and the possibility of Donald Trump winning the presidential election, as he is less likely to embrace it. How do you forecast the EV market to be next year?
Well, the good news is that the election is not happening to the end of November, right? So 2024, you don't have to worry about the Trump factor. But we can worry about the interest rates are expected to decline, but they're priced into the market, but they haven't declined yet, right? So the consumers, I mean, the mortgage market, you're seeing a bit of that because it's priced towards the longer end of the curve, which has priced in a lot of cuts in the future that haven't materialized. So meaning that consumers still feel a bite from higher interest rates. And as that bite, that lag effect of the Fed monetary policy, that should kind of temper a little enthusiasm, meaning the growth, the exceptional growth of EV you've seen in the US is likely to go into slow. But still, that's going to be the key driver of the EV market globally because it still has the IRA subsidies. So that should help. And in the second half of the year for 2024, the fact that rates are going lower, we think that the Fed's going to cut in May is going to support. Now, the other markets are not going to be so supportive, right? China slow down, Europe slow down is going to drive a slower growth into 2024. So in other words, it's still going to be an important, it's going to grow quite substantially, and particularly in the US market, but it's going to slow from great heights of 2023. And I think that is going to, it's already penciled into the market as for guidance are given for 2024. And I think for Korea, the export market will continue to be quite strong, but it's not going to be as strong as 2023. And beyond 2024, one of the key drivers of exports will not be there because the onshore capacity for the investment that Korea has made into the US, right? The factories are going to start to take advantage of the IRA. Because one of the key requests is that it needs to be produced in the US. And that means that Korean manufacturers will benefit, but onshore Korean production and onshore export to the US will likely decline from 2025 forward. So I think 2024 export will continue to be quite strong, but 2025 and moving forward, we'll have other drivers, whether Trump or not. You will have the fact that the key IRA component is that production will be made in the US. So Hyundai production will be increasingly in the US versus shipment from Korea into the US. So that will slow down exports beyond 2024.
All right, I see, Trin. Thank you for your projection. Now, Professor Yang, another major pillar of South Korean exports is actually the automobile industry, including the EV, of course. So let's take a broader look at that. South Korea's automobile exports this year have hit a record high for the January to November period. I'd like to know what drove this trend, and I'd like to also ask you how you forecast for South Korea's car exports for 2024 as well.
Okay, well, more than 2 million vehicles were exported this year. That's about 1 out of 2 vehicles produced in Korea. And the export value is expected to reach $70 billion. That's going to be an historical high. Why was the export demand so high? Well, a lot of it seems to be a pent-up demand. People wanted automobiles during the pandemic, but a lot of automobiles were not available because we had shortages in automobile-related semiconductors. Now that they are available, people seem to be buying up automobiles. They still seem to have money left over from payments made during the pandemic by the U.S. government, so they're using it to buy automobiles. So the part of the demand, pent-up demand, is not going to be around next year. U.S. Growth rate is expected to slow down substantially next year as well. So we will probably still see some rise in exports, but it will be nowhere as dramatic as this year. I wouldn't be surprised if it fell a little bit, but my crystal ball says it will continue to rise, just not at the current breakneck speed. But still, the pent-up demand will go away, I think. So we should be prepared for a very much slower growth than this year.
All right. Thank you, Professor Yang, and your crystal ball. All right. Well, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask this last question to our TRINH. Aside from what we have discussed so far, what are promising sectors that could potentially drive exports for South Korea? Could you briefly tell us?
China imports should improve, right? China has been quite, demand is very bad, so Chinese consumption should bounce. So beyond the ICT cycle, you should actually see an increase of demand from China, and that should be supportive for South Korea because it's an important market for South Korea, even if it's trying to diversify into other markets such as the US. So I think for Korean exports, and also oil is another one, right? Oil declined quite substantially, so refinery activity should go up, should oil rise, demand rise with China normalization of demand. So China growth itself will slow on a headline basis, but I think actual demand will show a firmer than what we have seen of demand for Korea. And beyond just what we discussed, which is auto, which has been a key driver of export growth, while other areas have declined quite substantially. So auto will take a bit of a backseat into the growth driver. And even though auto itself will grow, it's not going to be a gangbuster growth. And you'll see chips and as well as consumer electronics and et cetera will do a bit better. And I think on an aggregate, Korean exports itself will grow much stronger than what we've seen.
All right, TRINH, thank you for your point of view. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Yang and TRINH, for your time and insights as usual. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching and goodbye.